The seat my mother promised to save for me was already filled by the time I found the parking lot. I did not learn this from a phone call. I learned it from a photo my aunt posted on Facebook while I was still walking across the pavement in my good shoes. My entire family had driven 3 hours to attend an event at the state capitol building that afternoon, and not one of them had made that drive for me. They came because someone important was going to be in that room, and they wanted to stand close to that importance. What they did not know, what none of them had stopped to find out, was that the most important moment in that room was going to begin with my name. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever worked so long and so quietly for something that you stopped needing applause? And then the applause came anyway, in a room packed with the exact people who once told you that your work was not worth applauding. If that has happened to you, or if some part of you has always hoped it would, stay with this story all the way through. Because what happened to Emily the day the governor stood up is not something you will want to miss the ending of. My name is Emily Calloway, and I grew up in a family that measured a person's worth by the size of their paycheck and the sound of their job title when said out loud at a dinner party. My father was a civil engineer. My mother had worked in hospital administration for 22 years before she retired. My older brother Marcus ran a logistics company that he never stopped reminding people about. My younger sister, Dana, had married a financial advisor named Greg, and from the moment that happened, Dana never showed up anywhere without Greg's income folded into every sentence she spoke. That was the world I came from. That was the measuring stick that got held up against me every single time I walked back through my parents' front door. I became a teacher when I was 24 years old. I got my certification, I applied to 3 schools in our county, and I was hired by Millward Elementary in a district that had been underfunded for longer than most of the children I would be teaching had been alive. I want to be honest about something right from the beginning. I did not become a teacher because I had no other options. I had a business degree. I had a job offer from a marketing firm in the city that paid almost twice what the school district was offering. I turned it down. I turned it down because I had done a student teaching placement at Millward during my senior year, and I had met a boy named Caleb who was 8 years old and could not read a full sentence without his hands shaking from the effort of it. I had spent 6 weeks working with Caleb every afternoon after the other kids packed their bags. By the end of those 6 weeks, Caleb read 3 full pages of a chapter book out loud to me without stopping once. He looked up at me when he finished with an expression on his face that I had never seen on any person before. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were capable of something they had been told, quietly, through years of slow neglect, they would never be able to do. I chose teaching because of that look. I have never once regretted that choice. But the people around me regretted it loudly and often on my behalf. The first time my mother used the phrase lowly teacher, I was 25. We were at a family gathering at my Aunt Renee's house, one of those summer cookouts where everyone stands in clusters talking about the same things they always talk about. I had been telling my cousin's wife about a reading program I was trying to build at Millward, something that would let kids take books home over summer so they did not lose the progress they made during the school year. I was excited about it. I was genuinely lit up. My mother walked over mid-sentence, listened for about 30 seconds, and then said to my cousin's wife, in a voice she did not bother to lower, "Emily always did have a big heart. It is just a shame she is using it on such a lowly career." She said it with a smile. She said it the way you might say something you have said so many times privately that it no longer feels cruel to say it out loud. My cousin's wife looked uncomfortable. I stood there holding a paper plate and said nothing. I smiled and changed the subject and spent the rest of that afternoon making sure no one could tell that those words had gone somewhere inside me and sat down. That was the first time I heard it said out loud. It was not the last. Over the next several years, the message arrived in different forms, but always carried the same weight. My father stopped asking about my work almost entirely. When relatives asked what I did, he would say, "She works at a school," in a tone that closed the subject the way you close a drawer you do not want anyone to look through. My brother Marcus once told me at Christmas dinner that I was wasting my potential and that he could find me a position at his company if I ever decided I wanted a real career. He said real career the same way my mother said lowly teacher. Like those words were facts instead of opinions. like they had been verified by some authority that I was simply too stubborn to accept. I kept my head down. I went to work. I did not fight about it at family gatherings because I learned early that fighting about it did not change anything and only made me feel worse on the drive home. I poured everything I had into my classroom instead. I poured it into reading groups and science projects, and a little corner I built in the back of my room that I called the thinking spot, where kids could sit with a book or a journal or just sit quietly when the noise of the world got to be too much. I poured it into grant applications that I wrote after dinner on my own time, trying to get the school resources it was not getting from the district budget. I poured it into parents who did not know how to help their children at home and needed someone to show them, patiently and without judgment, what to do. I was doing real work. I knew that. But knowing it privately and being seen for it publicly are two very different things, and in my family, the gap between those two things had grown wide enough that I had quietly stopped expecting anyone to cross it. Then I met David. David Reyes was a man I met at a teacher training conference when I was 29. He was a middle school science teacher from a district 3 counties over, and he had the kind of laugh that made everyone in a room feel slightly more comfortable than they had been a moment before. We talked for 4 hours at that conference, which turned into dinner, which turned into a phone call that lasted until 2 in the morning, which turned into everything else. David was warm and funny and completely unbothered by the fact that we were both teachers. He understood the hours and the unpaid effort and the strange exhaustion of caring deeply about children who are not your own. He did not think any of it was lowly. He thought it was important. Being with someone who thought what I did was important was like being handed a glass of water after a very long walk. We were together for a year before I brought him home. I held off because I had reasons for holding off. I knew what my family was like. I knew what the dinner table conversation would be. I needed to feel steady enough in myself that whatever they said would not unravel me. By the time I brought David home for a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, I felt as steady as I had ever felt. I was 30 years old. I had been named one of 3 finalists for the county's Teacher of the Year award. My reading program had expanded to 4 other schools. I had a partner I loved. I felt like myself, maybe for the first time in a long time. The dinner was almost fine until it wasn't. It started with a question from Marcus, which is usually how it started. He asked David what he did, and David said he was a science teacher, and Marcus did that thing with his face that he did when he was deciding whether something was worth his full attention. He decided it wasn't. He turned back to his plate and said, in a way that communicated everything he felt about the answer without technically saying any of it. My mother asked David if he had ever thought about going into administration, because she had a friend whose husband moved from teaching into school administration, and now he made a very good salary. She said very good salary, the way a person says a destination they think you should have been traveling toward all along. David smiled and said he liked the classroom. My mother nodded in a way that meant she had already moved on inside her head. My father spent most of the dinner asking David about his family background, which I understood to be a polite investigation into whether David came from money or status that might compensate for the career. He didn't, not by my family's definition. His father had been a mechanic. His mother had worked at a grocery store. My father heard this and his questions grew shorter and further apart until he mostly just nodded and ate. After dinner, while David was helping my mother carry dishes into the kitchen, my father pulled me aside in the hallway and said, quietly and calmly, "Emily, I hope you know what you're doing." I asked him what he meant. He said, 2 teachers. That's a hard life is all I'm saying. I told him we were happy and that happiness was worth something. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Your happiness isn't going to pay a mortgage." Then he went back to the dining room. I stood in that hallway for a few seconds longer than I needed to. Then I straightened up and went to help David with the dishes. David and I got engaged 18 months later. I called my mother the same evening he proposed. She said congratulations and SH. E asked about the ring and she asked when we were thinking of having the wedding. She did not once, in that phone call, say that she was happy for me. She said she was glad I had found someone. There is a difference. I noticed it and I let it go and I told myself it was enough. The wedding planning started friendly and went sideways gradually, the way a car drifts toward the edge of a road so slowly that you don't fully register what's happening until the wheels are already in the gravel. My mother had opinions about the venue, the invitations, the menu, the flowers, and the seating arrangement. I listened to her opinions. I considered them. Some of them I agreed with, some of them I didn't. The ones I didn't agree with were the ones that created the friction. She wanted the wedding at a country club 40 minutes outside the city. I wanted the garden at the community center where David and I had volunteered every summer, a place that actually meant something to us. She said the community center would look cheap in photos. I said I didn't care how it looked in photos. She said that it was going to reflect on the whole family. I told her gently that it was my wedding and David's wedding, not the family's. She went quiet for 3 days after that call. When she came back with a new approach. She went through my Aunt Renee. Aunt Renee started calling me to pass along suggestions that were clearly coming from my mother, framed as if they were Renee's own gentle concerns. I recognized the approach because it was an old one. My mother had been routing conversations through Renee since I was a teenager. I did not say anything about it. I just started giving Renee short, pleasant answers that contained no new information. The wedding happened at the community center garden on a Saturday in June. It was beautiful. The light came through the oak trees the way light does in photographs that make people stop scrolling. David cried when he saw me come around the corner, and that was the only thing I needed from that entire day. Most of my family came. They were polite. My mother wore a look throughout the reception that I can only describe as managed disappointment. The expression of someone attending an event they had decided in advance was beneath their standards, but who had enough social grace to keep that decision mostly off their face. At the reception dinner, Marcus gave a toast that was technically kind, but structured in a way that made it sound like he was congratulating me for doing the best I could with the resources available to me. He talked about my big heart and my dedication and my love of children. All phrases that would have been lovely if the tone behind them had not been the tone of someone praising a child for the drawing they made with their left hand. David squeezed my hand under the table. I took a long, slow breath and smiled. Life after the wedding was good. It was genuinely good. David and I bought a small house in the district where I worked, close enough to Millward that I could sometimes walk on clear mornings. We had a son named James who arrived 2 years after the wedding with a full head of dark hair and David's laugh already forming somewhere in the sounds he made. We were tired in the way new parents are tired, which is a special category of tired that has no real comparison. But we were happy in a way that felt like something I had built rather than something that had simply happened to me. My career was moving in ways I had not entirely anticipated. The reading program I had started at Millward had by this point expanded beyond what I had originally imagined. I had written a curriculum model that the district had adopted formally, and that model had been reviewed by the state's Department of Education as part of a new literacy initiative they were building. I had been contacted by a woman named Dr. Patricia Osai, who worked in the state's Education Policy Office, and she had asked me to be part of a small working group that was developing new early literacy standards for the entire state. I was 34 years old, still teaching my own classroom at Millward, and also flying to the state capitol once every 6 weeks to sit in rooms with policymakers and researchers and explain, from the ground up, what actually worked in a real classroom with real children who had real obstacles in front of them. I did not tell my family about any of this. I want to be honest about why. It was not because I was hiding it. It was because I had learned that telling my family about my professional life created 2 possible outcomes. The first was that they would minimize it. The second was that they would try to attach themselves to it in some way that made it feel like their achievement instead of mine. I had experienced enough of both outcomes that I had stopped volunteering information. My parents knew I was still teaching. My mother still occasionally asked if I had thought abo. Doing something else. I said no, that was about the extent of it. The distance had been growing for years, but the moment it became something formal and undeniable was Thanksgiving of the year James turned 3. We had gathered at my parents' house, the full family. Marcus was there with his wife Cheryl and their 2 kids. Dana was there with Greg and their daughter Paige. David and I were there with James. My Aunt Renee and her husband were there. 2 of my parents' neighbors had been invited, a couple named the Hendersons who had known my parents for 30 years and who were always pleasant in that practiced, effortless way that people who have never experienced real hardship often are. It was a full table. It was a loud afternoon. At some point during the meal, one of the Hendersons asked around the table what everyone did. It was one of those questions that older guests ask at gatherings, the kind meant to keep conversation moving without actually requiring depth. Marcus answered first and went long. He talked about his company's expansion into new freight routes and a contract he had recently landed that he was clearly very proud of. Greg went next and talked about interest rates and client portfolios in a way that made two people at the table glaze over visibly. My father talked about the consulting work he still did in retirement. Dana mentioned that she was thinking of going back to work part-time once Paige started school. Then Mrs. Henderson turned to me and asked what I did. I said I was a teacher. She smiled and said how wonderful, and she asked what grade. I said third grade, but I also mentioned the curriculum work. I said it the same way I would have said anything, just a fact in a sentence. I said that I was currently on a state working group advising on early literacy policy. There was a pause at the table that lasted about 2 seconds. Then my mother said, "Emily volunteers her time in various ways," and moved the conversation forward to something about the sweet potato dish. She called it volunteering. The work I had been doing for the State Department of Education, the work that had required travel and preparation and the restructuring of my entire schedule, she called it volunteering and redirected the conversation before anyone could ask a follow-up question. I looked at David. He looked at me. He did not say anything because he knew me well enough to know that I did not need him to. I picked up my fork and I kept eating. But something shifted in me at that table. Something that had been patient for a very long time became less patient. Not angry, not yet, just less willing to sit quietly and absorb. I started paying attention to the pattern in a new way. I started writing things down, not for any purpose I had defined, just because writing things down helped me see them more clearly. I wrote down the volunteering comment. I wrote down the dinner conversation when Marcus had said real career. I wrote down my father's comment in the hallway before my wedding. I wrote down every moment I could remember where what I did had been made to feel like less. And when I read it all together on a Tuesday night, while David was giving James a bath, I saw the full shape of something I had been experiencing one small piece at a time for over a decade. It was not that my family was casually thoughtless. It was that they had a consistent, structured belief that what I had chosen to do with my life was worth less than what they had chosen to do with theirs. And that belief expressed itself in small and medium and occasionally large ways, regularly, persistently, and without any apparent awareness of the cumulative damage it was doing. I let another 6 months go by. I was not yet ready to do anything with what I had seen. I was still processing it. I was still teaching, still working on the state policy project, still raising James, still building a life that felt genuinely mine. I was not sitting in bitterness, but I was no longer pretending not to see. The project with the State Department of Education had been building toward something for most of that year. Dr. Ose had told the working group in the spring that the governor's office had taken interest in the literacy initiative, which had grown from a regional pilot into something with real state-level implications. The governor, a woman named Governor Halstead, who had made education one of the defining issues of her administration, had decided to formalize the program by creating a new state award. It was called the Cornerstone Educator Recognition, and it was designed to identify teachers across the state whose classroom work had demonstrated measurable, transferable impact, meaning teachers whose methods had changed outcomes not just for their own students, but for students in other schools through curriculum sharing, mentorship, or policy contribution. There would be 10 recipients in the inaugural year. Each one would be recognized at a public ceremony at the state capitol. Dr. Osai told me I was one of the 10. She told me in a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot after dismissal. I had my gradebook open on my lap, and I was holding a juice box I had forgotten to throw away from lunch. She said my name, and then she said that the selection committee had reviewed my file and wanted me to know that my curriculum model and my work on the policy team had been among the strongest submissions reviewed in the inaugural selection process. She said the ceremony would be at the state capitol on the 14th, that the governor would be speaking, and that families were welcome to attend. I thanked her. I said it genuinely. I sat in my car after the call ended, and I pressed my back against the seat, and I looked at the ceiling and I breathed slowly. Then I thought about what to do next. The rational thing, the thing I would have done 2 years earlier, was to call my parents and invite them. To announce the news with some excitement and extend the invitation in good faith and hope for the best. But I was not 2 years earlier. I was right here, right now, in possession of 10 years of evidence about what happened when I extended invitations and shared news and hoped for the best. So instead of calling my parents first, I called David. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment and then said, very simply, "You deserve this." Just those 3 words, nothing more was needed. We decided together that we would invite my family, but we decided to invite them without the announcement of the award. We decided to invite them to attend an event at the state capitol on the 14th without telling them what the event was about. We said only that it was related to Emily's work and that she would be glad if they came. This was not a trick or a trap. I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to set anyone up for embarrassment. I was trying to protect myself from the experience of announcing something important and having it dismissed or minimized before it even happened. I was trying to give the news the chance to land without being filtered through my family's interpretation of it before it reached the room. My mother responded to the invitation the way my mother responded to most things, with questions designed to determine whether the effort of attending was worth the return. She asked what kind of event it was. I said it was a recognition ceremony related to education policy. She asked if it was formal. I said the invitation said business attire. She asked if Marcus and Dana were invited. I said, of course, everyone was welcome. She said she would check with your father and let me know. She let me know 2 days later that my father and she would come. Marcus said he was busy but might be able to make it work. Dana said she and Greg would be there because they happened to be visiting the city that weekend anyway, so it was easy. My Aunt Renee, who I had also invited, said absolutely and asked if she could bring her daughter Teresa. I said yes. So there was my family. Informed that something was happening, invited in good faith, coming to the state capitol on the 14th with no real idea what they were walking into. The morning of the 14th, I was up before 5. I put on a dark blue dress that I had bought specifically for this event. It had clean lines and felt serious without being stiff. David wore his good gray suit and looked exactly the way a person looks when they are proud of someone and have no interest in concealing it. James wore a small button-down shirt that he kept trying to untuck from his pants on the drive over, and we kept tucking it back in, and he thought this was a game. We arrived at the Capitol building early because I wanted to check in with Dr. Osai's team and understand where I would be seated. The ceremony was being held in the main reception hall, which was a wide, high-ceilinged room with long windows that let in the morning light and rows of chairs set up in a formal arrangement facing a raised platform. It was already filling up when we arrived. There were people in suits and people in formal dresses, and people with lanyards and clipboards moving with purpose. There were photographers along the edges of the room and a sound system being checked. It felt significant. It felt like a room where things that mattered were going to happen. Dr. Ose found me near the entrance. She shook my hand with both of hers and said she was glad I was there. She introduced me to 2 of the other honorees, a man named Robert who taught advanced mathematics in a rural district 3 hours south, and a woman named Carla who had built a bilingual reading program in a border community that had transformed literacy rates across 3 consecutive grade levels. These were serious, quiet, accomplished people. I felt completely at home with them. My family arrived 40 minutes before the start. I saw them come through the main entrance from across the room. My father was in a sport coat. My mother had dressed up properly and was looking around the room with the careful attention she gave to places she was trying to assess quickly. Marcus had made it after all and was standing beside Cheryl with his hands in his pockets, already surveying the crowd for people of status the way he always did in a new room. Dana was with Greg, and Dana was texting, and Greg was talking to someone who had apparently turned out to be a financial acquaintance of his, which made Greg immediately more comfortable. My Aunt Renee and her daughter Teresa were behind them, Renee looking genuinely curious and warm the way she always did. I also noticed something as I watched them walk in. My mother had promised to save me a seat. She had said so in a text message that morning. "We'll get there early enough to save seats for you and David and James." But as I watched them settle into a row near the middle of the room, I counted the seats and understood that the configuration was not arranged for me at all. Marcus had taken the seat closest to the aisle, then his wife, then my parents, then Dana and Greg. Teresa and Renee had taken the two at the end of the row. There was no seat saved for Emily. There was no gap in the arrangement. They had organized themselves as a unit, and Emily was not factored into the unit. I stood and looked at the row for a moment, then I walked over. My mother saw me first and smiled the smile she gave at events where she was trying to manage appearances. She said I looked lovely. I thanked her. I told her that I needed to sit with the other honorees during the ceremony and would not be in the general seating. She nodded and said of course, and then she asked what other honorees meant. I said there were 9 other educators being recognized today alongside me. She looked at me and asked what I was being recognized for. I said I would explain after, then I walked back to the front of the room. I heard her say something to my father as I walked away. I did not hear exactly what. I heard my father's voice respond in a low tone. I did not turn around. The ceremony began at 10. Governor Halstead entered the room to an applause that filled the high ceiling and bounced back down. She was a compact, direct woman with very clear eyes and the kind of presence that made a room pay attention without requiring any performance from her. She greeted the audience briefly and then introduced the Cornerstone Educator recognition with a speech that I want to try to describe accurately, because it mattered. She talked about teaching, not in the abstract way that politicians sometimes talk about teaching, using it as a symbol for other things they actually want to say. She talked about it directly and specifically. She talked about the research that showed what the first 3 years of reading instruction determined, not just about literacy, but about every other area of academic development. She talked about the school districts in this state where that critical window was being underserved, not because teachers did not care, but because they lacked the tools and the time and the support to do what the research said was possible. She talked about the initiative that had come out of the working group. And then she said something that I did not expect. She said that the Cornerstone Educator recognition existed because of the work of teachers who had operated at the intersection of classroom practice and policy development. She said these teachers had done something rare, which was to refuse the boundary between what happens inside a classroom and what gets decided outside of it. She said that one submission had been described by the review committee as the clearest articulation of transferable literacy methodology they had encountered in 20 years of reviewing such work. She looked down at her notes for a moment. Then she looked up and said, "I want to begin today by calling the name of Emily Calloway, whose reading curriculum has now been adopted in 47 schools across this state, and whose work on this year's policy team helped reshape how we are going to approach early literacy for the next generation of students in our public schools." The applause started before I had fully stood up. I was aware of the sound first, then the faces turning toward me, then my own legs carrying me forward toward the platform. I shook the governor's hand. She held it for a moment and said something to me quietly that I will keep for myself. I received the recognition certificate, which was housed in a dark wooden frame with the state seal in the upper corner. I turned to face the room. My family was in the middle section. I could see all of them from the platform, which meant I could see their faces. My Aunt Renee had both hands pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were bright. Teresa was clapping with her whole body. Those. E2 I locked onto for a second, because I needed to look at someone who was purely happy for me. Then I let my eyes move. My mother's hands were in her lap. She was not clapping. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something that looked like the moment a person realizes a calculation they have been making for a very long time has been wrong. My father's hands were moving slowly together, the kind of polite applause you give when you are still deciding how to feel. Marcus was clapping, actually clapping with real energy, which surprised me, but his face had the look of a man recalculating. Dana had looked up from her phone and was staring at me with an expression that was somewhere between shocked and uncertain. Greg, to his credit, was clapping clearly and without confusion. I stood on that platform for the length of time you stand there. I smiled the smile of someone who has waited a very long time for something and has now arrived and knows it. Then I walked back to my seat, and the ceremony moved on to the other 9 honorees. each of whom deserved every second of recognition they received. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjacent room. Coffee and pastries and the long, organized chaos of people greeting each other and taking photographs and exchanging cards. I took photographs with the governor, with Dr. Osai, with the other 9 honorees, with David, with James, who kept trying to touch the state seal on the certificate frame and had to be gently redirected several times. My family found me about 20 minutes into the reception. They came as a group. My mother reached me first. She did not apologize. I want to be clear about that because the story is not built on an apology. The story is built on what actually happened, which is more complicated and in some ways more true. What my mother did was reach out and take both my hands and hold them and look at my face for a long moment and say, "Emily, I had no idea." Just that, 4 words. I looked at her, I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I took a breath. I thought about what to say. And then I said, quietly, because we were in a public room and I was not interested in a scene, "I think you know the answer to that." She looked away. Her eyes went somewhere else for a second. Then they came back. She said, "I want to do better." And I heard something in her voice that I had not heard before. I heard the sound of a person who has realized they have been holding something upside down for so long that the shape of it started to feel normal. My father shook my hand. His handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually last between people who are not strangers. He said, "I'm proud of you." He did not say "I'm sorry," but the handshake said something. Marcus pulled me into a hug that was real. He is not a person who does fake hugs. He said, "I did not know any of this." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You told me I needed a real career, Marcus, at our parents' Christmas dinner, in front of everyone." He went quiet. He stood there with that information and did not try to argue with it. That silence was something. Dana hugged me and cried a little, which I had not expected. Dana was not someone who cried easily. She said she was sorry and that she had missed it and that she should have paid more attention. I believed her. Dana had always been more follower than leader in the family dynamic. She absorbed the culture of the room she was in. That was not entirely her fault. It was something she was going to have to work on, but the responsibility for creating the culture she had been absorbing did not rest fully with her. My Aunt Renee held me for a long time and said nothing. That was exactly right. Renee had always understood that there were moments when words were the lesser option. The drive home was quiet in the best possible way. James fell asleep in the back seat before we had left the Capitol parking lot. David drove and I held the certificate frame in my lap and watched the city move past the window. David reached over at a red light and put his hand on mine. I turned my hand over and held his. I want to be honest about what the day was and was not. It was not a victory over my family. That framing would be too small and too mean for what actually happened. What it was a clarification. It was the day when something that had existed only inside my own knowledge and experience became visible to the people who had been standing close to me for years without actually seeing me. The governor did not vindicate me. I had been doing the work long before the governor knew my name. The work was always real. What changed was that the people around me could no longer organize themselves around a version of Emily that they had constructed to make their own choices feel larger by comparison. The weeks after the ceremony were complicated in the way Hat Truth usually makes things complicated before it makes them simpler. My mother called me 3 times in the first 2 weeks. She did not call to perform apology. She called the way a person calls when they are trying to understand something and have realized they cannot understand it alone. She asked questions about the curriculum work, genuine questions, and I answered them. She asked what the policy process looked like, and I explained it. She asked about James, which she always asked about, but she also asked about me in a way she had not asked in a long time. Not, "How are things going?" but specific questions. What was I working on next? What was the response in the other schools that had adopted the curriculum? What did I think was going to change about early literacy policy at the state level? She was learning how to be curious about me. That was not nothing. That was actually a lot. My father called once on a Sunday morning and talked to me for 40 minutes. He talked about his own career and the choices he had made and some regret he had about those choices that I had not known he carried. He did not make the call about me, but it was about me in the way that conversations sometimes are when they circle around the real thing before landing on it. At the end of the call, he said, "I think I had you wrong, Emily." I said, "You had a category for me that didn't fit." He said, "That's a fair way to put it." I said it was okay, I meant it. Marcus sent me an article about the Literacy Initiative a month after the ceremony. He had found it in a trade publication he read for business. He texted it with no commentary except, "Saw this and thought of you." That was Marcus. That was actually a version of Marcus that I liked and could work with. I want to say something clearly before the end of this story, something I thought about a great deal in the months that followed that day at the Capitol. I did not build my career to prove anything to my family. I built it because it was mine and it was real and it mattered to me and to the children I served and eventually to the policy work it fed into. The validation from the outside world, from the governor, from the recognition, it was meaningful. I would be dishonest if I said it was not. But it was meaningful in the way that confirmation of something you already know feels meaningful. Not because it told me something new about myself, but because it gave the truth a public surface that others could finally touch. I also want to say something about Caleb, the boy who could not read a full sentence without shaking. I looked him up the year after the ceremony because the curiosity had never fully left me. He was 23 years old. He was studying to be an electrical engineer at a state university. I found this out through a brief exchange with his mother on the elementary school's community social page, where she had posted something about his acceptance into a technical program. I did not contact Caleb directly. I did not need to. I just needed to know that the look I had seen on his face at 8 years old, that specific look of a person discovering they are capable of something they had been told was beyond them, I needed to know that look had gone somewhere real. It had. It went exactly where it was supposed to go. My name is Emily Calloway, and I am a teacher. I chose this deliberately. I will make this choice again every morning until there is no more morning left to choose in. And somewhere in a state that is now teaching 47 schools full of children to read using a method I built in my own classroom after hours on a Tuesday, after years of being told it was lowly to care this much, I believe with everything I have that the work was worth every single thing it cost me to do it. It was never about my family seeing it. But I will not pretend that, when they finally did, it did not feel like something. It did. Before you close this video, I want to leave you with one question that I have been turning over since the day the governor spoke Emily's name. If the recognition had never come, if no one outside her classroom had ever formally acknowledged what Emily built, would the work have been any less real? Emily knows the answer. I think you might know it too. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Emily's place. Would you have invited your family, knowing what you know about them? Would you have kept the news to yourself entirely? Would you have confronted them before the ceremony or after? There is no wrong answer. But I believe the question says a great deal about what we truly think, love, and respect each other. Emily will be back, and so will I.